Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our latest live stream. I'm, of course, Sandy Campbell. I am the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. We're thrilled that you've taken some time to join us here this morning. As always, a couple quick updates of some programs on the horizon. In 2 weeks from today, which is almost exactly the 6-month anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, we are going to be featuring our amazing 4 panelists looking at rule of law issues. So we'll be talking certainly about the Capitol insurrection and some of course, the fallout of that and how the legal system and so on have responded to it. Bring your questions. There's a lot to talk about. I have a feeling we'll probably talk about some of the litigation underway against the Trump organization. And so there'll be a lot to talk about then. A new talk that we haven't announced yet, but I will tell you about right now. On Friday, August the 13th, we are going to get into the future of the Peace Corps. And we'll be interviewing the head of the National Peace Corps Association alongside Diego Romero, who many of you know is about to become a Peace Corps volunteer, and he was an amazing intern for us, and he's just a brilliant young man. And then for our in-person gathering, we are currently planning on Thursday, August 26th at the Women's Club for our famous State of the State Department luncheon. So details of that will be finalized this coming week. We, of course, like everyone, are keeping our eyes on the Delta variant and this very odd moment in time that seems to be continuing. So obviously we will update that as things go. But at the very least, we're thrilled you're here today. And let me now bring in today's speaker. We have with us Jessica Bedoya. Good morning, Jessica. How are you? Oh, and you are on mute. The classic words of this time.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon for the East Coast, and good morning to everybody.
So Jessica, I'll just really quickly read your bio. Jessica is the Chief of Staff and Executive Advisor in the Office of the Presidency at the Inter-American Development Bank, and she is the primary advisor to the President on matters of institutional strategy and investment policy while leading the bank's operations. So we have a lot that we want to talk about today. We have a region in Latin America that is undergoing many challenges right now. But I think, Jessica, why don't we start with a little bit about you? You know, you've worked at the White House, at State, at CIA, NSC on policy. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how all of these posts have kind of created the amazing different puzzle pieces of your career?
Great, thank you. And again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Yes, a little bit about me. I don't want to go through and tick off all the boxes of my bio since you just did a great job of providing a summary, but you know, I have about a 16-year career in government, US government. I'd always been very passionate about international relations. I'd studied foreign policy. I was a student of the region for a very long time, first because my parents come from the region. I'm a first-generation American, so I am a child of an Ecuadorian mom and a Colombian dad who came to the United States for better opportunities because the region didn't have it and couldn't provide it for them. And I'll mention that a little later as it relates to how now, ironically, I'm here at the IDB. But my diplomatic work, my work as a political analyst in intelligence focused on Latin America, I think all contributed to the way that I look at the region and the way that I objectively can take a look at problems, break them apart, put them back together, and understand the role of engaging governments, sharing messages, working hand in hand with those stakeholders, both at the community level, at the local government level, and at the maximum government level. I think all of those perspectives, understanding how institutions work, constitutions work, structures, and personalities, and getting to know leadership all contributed to ultimately my goal, which was always trying to have a direct hand and a positive impact on policymaking. And so for anyone in foreign policy, and especially in Washington, having an opportunity to work at the National Security Council is always a great achievement to strive for. And I'm very blessed to have had that opportunity and ultimately to have been able to translate that into development finance work when I later went to the Development Finance Corporation, where I focused on the Western Hem. I say all of that to say that you're absolutely right. It's a puzzle for me in terms of my career, where all these components of analysis, diplomacy, development finance. I'm now putting together in an amazing opportunity as chief of staff at the Inter-American Development Bank, where every day I literally wake up incredibly excited because not only do we have amazing people at this institution, but this institution is a standard bearer of development in Latin America. We're the leading institution. And I feel that in my everyday politics, diplomacy, development finance, economics, all of it comes together, and thankfully I have a great team that works with me, and I'm able to be enthusiastic about being able to lead the charge of what the strategy is for the IDB in the region, how we can work with governments, and in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of operations, get into those details, which I love, because for me, being in the field was always the best part of my diplomatic career and my work in foreign policy. So it's a great opportunity, and I'm very blessed to be here.
So let's switch gears and talk about the IDB itself. Give us a quick overview of what the IDB is. I know that could be a long answer, but tell us a little bit about what the IDB is and why you do what you do.
Sure. Well, Inter-American Development Bank, we've been here for almost 62 years, created, and we continue to be the leading development finance institution for Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we have a lot that we do. We focus on a lot of various traditional development issues, social infrastructure, community, big infrastructure programs and projects focused on a lot of support for the youth, on health sectors. So we do an array of financing of projects in the region. And now we also do a lot of private sector financing. Post 2015, the IDB expanded by creating and empowering the private sector arm of this institution. So we have IDB Invest that creates opportunities for financing in private sector and works with commercial banks. We also work with IFC and other DFIs. And then we have IDB Lab. We're actually the only multilateral institution to have an innovation laboratory that focuses a lot on identifying new areas for investment, seed capital for venture capitals for young entrepreneurs. And it's a testing laboratory for us that I have had the opportunity to see firsthand, has a great impact on young entrepreneurs in the region. And it's really really motivating work that we do through the IDB Lab space. On the public sector side, we historically work with our 26 borrowing member countries who are all in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also have 22 non-borrowing member countries comprised of the United States, Europe, and Asia. And all of those countries contribute as donors and co-financiers. And we work with our counterpart development finance organizations internationally to find opportunities for investment and financing to have that impact. Our focus here is to better the lives of everyone and to improve impact in the region. And we're trying to do that day in, day out.
And it's constantly shifting, so it's got to be a constant.
Yeah, it's very dynamic.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how the IDB, given that the challenges are ongoing and layered and connected in so many ways, how does the IDB sort of make a difference and impact or have influence in sort of influencing or improving some of the major issues going on in the region today?
So luckily, when I came in with the new administration on October 1st of 2020, we came in already inheriting an institution with an incredibly good and strong reputation in the region as an honest broker. And I think for any multilateral development bank, the challenge really is how to be viewed objectively, apolitically, and within the confines of our agenda, which is development. And I would say that the Inter-American Development Bank has strived for and achieved having quite a role as an honest broker in the region that helps us and generates that confidence and that level of confidence when you have an IDB stamp of approval project and when we work with governments hand in hand. So I think, I don't want to say that it's been easy, but I think we were handed already a really well-formed and a well-articulated reputationally institution that has helped us guide and helped us establish a new direction for how we want to have impact. For us, impact and having lived it firsthand in terms of the role that our US government agencies have, USAID and others, and seeing how other governments contribute on development, we came in thinking, we can't make everything a priority. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So how do we identify those key opportunities in the region where we can have more impact now, given the COVID context that we're looking at and the clamor in the region that all of us, even globally, are feeling of the need to kickstart recovery. So as it relates to that, we developed what's now called Vision 2025, which is our agenda that prioritizes 5 key areas for investment and financing, both on the public and private sector sides. And those those 5 areas, which are digitalization, nearshoring, gender, climate change, and financing for SMEs, are all areas that now our entire institution is focused on prioritizing so that we can have a direct hand in kickstarting the recovery post-COVID. Obviously, results is the other side of that metric. Yes, you can finance, but you need to measure results. And so we're also actively working with our new executive vice president to see how we can improve operational efficacy in the region. Something I personally am committed to is making sure that we touch every life. And we have to make sure that as part of our mission, even touching one life is a success. So that's how we've tried to design Vision 2025 and have a really strict focus on how we can measure those results so that we can, at the end of the day, tell governments what we've achieved, fix what we couldn't achieve, make it better, and replicate those models of success.
So can you talk a little bit along those lines about the distinction between, a long-term investment, pursuing these 5 priorities over time, knowing that, things are not going to change tomorrow, versus, the IDB's response to things like, a coup attempt in Haiti, to street protests in Colombia and Cuba, to, a contested presidential election in Peru. I know we can talk about these more case studies in a bit more detail later, but how does the bank distinguish between immediate pressing, oh my goodness, needs versus that kind of more longer term window of investment and development?
Sure. I think the way we do it is through trial and error a little bit, because I think as a new team, we have a new executive team and we all share the same mindset, which is where governments right now are in triaging mode, trying to put fires out. And we understand that we can help them think about those plans, those long-term plans. But that doesn't stop our ability to, in tandem, work with them and identify those immediate needs and figure out where we can play a role. And so a lot of what we've actually been doing on the ground through our teams, I should have mentioned, we have representatives in all of the 26 of our borrowing member countries who lead all of our operations in country. They've been tasked to have constant and fluid conversations with our governments so that we can understand what the clients actually need. And we can actually also propose how we can solve immediate needs. Obviously, COVID is at the forefront, but we understand women are the engine of growth for recovery. Youth, teleeducation, telemedicine, telehealth are all issues now that are becoming front burner for a lot of governments. How can we help them? So over the long term, we still provide support in terms of implementing regulatory reforms, helping develop policies, providing technical assistance so that governments can provide the institutional and legal frameworks necessary to enhance the laws, to enhance the ability to implement a lot of these programs and projects. But also in the short term, what we're doing is providing immediate financing. We facilitated our financing in 2020 by facilitating approvals and disbursements, and have created and used new instruments innovatively so that we can get money to governments faster. That's in the short term to provide responses to COVID, responses to ETA and IOTA, the hurricanes that happened in November that affected Central America and Colombia, and also ongoing crises that we see like the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent. So we're able to do that expeditiously while also keeping an eye on those long-term financing, the infra projects, the health sector reforms, but we are championing with governments. We understand you have needs that are long-term and we will be there with you step by step, but we are also here to provide you with opportunities to understand what the financing is that you need immediately and what are those needs that maybe you're not even seeing because you're so busy and trying to triage the immediate needs of the public. Obviously, political instability is something that we all live with right now. We at the IDB are committed to working with our clients, which are the governments. And so actually the president and I recently had a call with the newly elected and confirmed president of Peru, President Castillo, to ensure that he is aware that the IDB stands ready to support his government and their agenda, and the new minister of economy, when he's on board, he or she's on board. So again, short term, absolutely. And I think that a lot of the thinking that can be done, we're doing. And it's a new way of approaching the jobs, frankly, for our representatives, that, we see them as the ambassadors for the IDB in the region. Work across all stakeholders, inside and outside government. Let them know we're here, identify areas of opportunity for cooperation, and help them prioritize, because we're that honest broker.
So I guess just a bigger level question, how does the IDB intersect with, the World Bank, with the IMF? How does it play out amongst those other multilateral financing institutions?
Sure. We're a partner. We're a partner to all of them. And actually, one of the first things that the President Mauricio and I did when we came to the IDB is we had a call with the managing director of the IMF and David Malpass at the World Bank so that we could align, because we've realized that a lot of the things that they're hearing in terms of trends, needs, and demands in the region are exactly the same as the ones we're hearing. Obviously, we're hearing it from the same clients, but we need better coordination. So what we've done is that we've actually developed country platforms in each of our countries where our representatives are now tasked to hold regular meetings with their counterparts at the World Bank, IFC, UN, other international organizations, IMF, to work hand in hand with them. We actually tested this with the Eta and Iota crisis after the hurricanes in Central America in November, and it actually worked very well. And we were really, really pleased with that, because what it did is that it effectively avoided the reinvention of the wheel or the duplicative efforts of assistance, because when governments are in crisis, we know that they just ask for what they need. And what we need to do is make sure that we're coordinated so that we're addressing all of the needs and not leaving gaps behind. And so I think that test proved that that coordination and close coordination is essential. It's happening in Argentina as they're negotiating their agreement with the IMF, and our financing projects are going through, and we need to make sure that we know where the government stands on their discussions. It's also happening in Ecuador, and it's happening all over the region. I'm really proud to say that's something that we try to push on day one, and it's actually activated and proving to be a really good model.
Okay. Follow-up question on that. So, in 2010, with the earthquake that hit Haiti, a huge amount of development aid went in to help people. There have been lots of criticisms about how that money was administered, and ultimately the question becomes, in a situation like that, people are in need of assistance, but the public systems to deliver that assistance are so injured or absent that they're not able to do so. And so in the Haiti case, and this is a case that happens in many cases around the world, NGOs would come in and set up their own structures to deliver their services. How, within this dynamic of we need to help people now versus we need to help systems grow over time, how does the IDB approach that kind of very difficult dynamic?
I'm actually glad you're asking that, because it's very timely, because I just had a conversation with members of our team yesterday discussing Haiti as an example of lessons learned for Venezuela, frankly, for the day one. I experienced the Haiti earthquake crisis from a very different perch and traveled to Haiti soon after. And I remember the amount of donor interest and the money that was coming into Haiti. And you're absolutely right. When you have, it's not even a matter of weak institutions governmentally, but if you don't have a mechanism of accountability to track, identify use of resources, have accountability metrics for results and delivery units to ensure that that money is getting to the projects it's supposed to get, it won't work. And I think what we've taken internally as we're developing our own strategy on how to support Venezuela in their transition when they get there, we've also looked at what are the lessons learned for the IDB. What we can do, and something that we're exploring, is how we can now start designing mechanisms that have that accountability embedded, because we do have engagement and relationships with executing agencies and implementing agencies and NGOs, and that's something that we need to strengthen. I think that we have a capacity to develop mechanisms that governments, we can work with governments to then develop and strengthen further, but provide a proposal of a design and a mechanism that we can work with donors, and donors can have that sort of greater sense of confidence that the money and the funds will be identified and used appropriately. And that's something that we're trying to do with Venezuela now with our migration fund and our initiative, in terms of being able to generate greater donor interest, because what we want to avoid is the donor fatigue issue that we also have seen in Haiti. And I think another lesson is, if we have a design and we have a mechanism and we have accountability, then you can build out from that by being able to vet implementing agencies, vet NGOs. And I think that that is something that's an initial idea that actually our teams are working on right now. I'm excited to say on what we can do, what we can propose in terms of a design, because part of what we really want to offer as a value added is not just that you can look to us to finance projects in the short term in a humanitarian crisis, but you can look to, donors can look to us as a partner with accountability, with standards of transparency, so that they can have confidence that the funds will flow to where they need to get to, ultimately the people.
And how does IDB approach these areas of great risk ultimately? if the accountability structures within a national government, I mean, let's just say Haiti, for example, if they're not there or they're not robust, does that change or influence how IDB approaches it and may ultimately say the risk of this investment, can't be, is not something that we can tolerate? Or how does that issue of risk in terms of political instability, for example, play out across the IDB?
Our job is to take risks. I mean, I think coming from a position where in the past, and I've said this to our teams in working in national security in various capacities, the day-to-day risk is at such a high level that when both the president and I stepped in here, we said, we're a development finance bank institution. And so as a DFI, as a multilateral, we can take risks here. We should take risks. We have to measure them. We have to have mitigating strategies. We have to abide by the transparency and governance controls that we have, those safeguards that drive our operations. But we need to take risks here because this is actually a safe place to take risks, because ultimately the outcome would be improving at least one life. So for us, we obviously have the safeguards that I just mentioned that guide and serve as our guiding principles when we review operations. But in a case like Haiti, for example, and I'm incredibly passionate about Haiti, and anyone here can tell you that. One of my first conversations here was with executive director from Haiti, and Mauricio is equally as passionate about finding ways to support the country and the people. But obviously, we do have to make calculations of timing and sequencing. We want to make sure, in a volatile situation, and this matters everywhere, whether it's a natural disaster or political crisis or protest, we want to make sure, number one, that our staff are safe. And number two, that the integrity of our operations can be maintained. And so we are constantly evaluating that. And that happens no matter what. No matter the country and no matter the context, we have to constantly evaluate the integrity of operations. Because risk, yes, we're here to take risks because the payoff is having impact, but we also have to be measured and be cautious about the timing and the sequencing because it's an incredibly volatile region. There's triggers everywhere right now because of COVID and everyone's frustrations and the economic disparities that are even more elaborate now and apparent. So risk for us is the name of the game. Safeguards also, so that we're responsible.
So 3 thematics I want to talk about, and I think we should start with COVID-19, given that segue, but I want to talk about COVID-19. I want to talk about women in leadership at the IDB, and I want to talk about climate change. So sure. In terms of coronavirus, in terms of, we know that it's ravaging, Latin America as much as anywhere in the world. There was that fascinating article yesterday, I think, in the Post talking about how there was massive underreporting of cases in Mexico. How and what is the IDB doing? Are you supporting vaccines, securing and rollout? Are you looking at bigger and broader issues around how in the world are we going to come back from this? Tell us a little bit about IDB's approach to sure. COVID-19.
Sure. A couple of things, both short-term and long-term. First thing we did is we announced $1 billion to work with governments on the financing side. One of the first things we looked at and examined in depth is the COVAX facility. What countries were part of the COVAX facility? Who was having problems with the prepayments? How could we provide financing? So we've disbursed almost $600 million to help countries in terms of financing to participate in the COVAX facility so they could have access to vaccines. That's step one. The $1 billion is on top of that because we decided that we needed to have more readily available resources for any plans, any contingency required by governments and partners to obtain the vaccines to get it to the people. And this includes financing for the supply chain of the vaccine in terms of the cold chain facilities, the transport, the distribution, the training of staff. All of that is part and parcel of the $1 billion that we have announced. In addition to that, we had been hearing that a lot of these countries were having issues in the negotiations with the pharmaceutical companies. So immediately what we designed with our teams, the amazing technical experts that we work with, is now we announced and are providing an indemnity guarantees to provide those insurance for those important clauses that the pharmaceuticals are requiring governments to hew to before signing and providing the vaccines. So those are the 2 immediate things that we did, in addition to a lot of programmatic efforts of a lot of our health financing for projects. There directing them directly to the COVID response efforts in the countries that we assist. The other more long-term issues that we're looking at, obviously, in terms of COVID, is we are thinking, what does recovery look like? What does it mean? Because it's going to differentiate from country to country in terms of priorities. But at the core, it's getting people back to work. At the core, it's getting people connected. At the core, it's getting people access to healthcare. So those are the three areas that we're focusing on. And I think a lot of what we're initially looking in terms of long-term financing for those big development projects is, how do we then increase digitalization? How do we ensure that the communities are connected? Because what we're seeing also is the immense disparity between rich and poor, urban and rural communities in terms of connectivity. And now that's become a critical component of just the day-to-day life. So we're also looking at working with governments on all of these issues in terms of digitalization, but also job growth and job creation, upskilling and reskilling. I think that this is an incredible moment, because right now what we're seeing is startling statistics. Almost 70% are now going to be part of the informal economy, which was already a huge barrier in our region in terms of development, of getting folks formalized, getting them into the formal economy. And now we're seeing a reversal, and that's huge. Almost 70 million people could be falling into poverty. A middle class that was nascent could now be eradicated. So these are issues that will require longer term solutions. And so that is part of why our Vision 2025 agenda is driving a prioritization of all of these issues, that when mapped together and when prioritized based on the needs of specific countries, we're hoping we can get the money out the door to the governments and to the people.
One of the great challenges that we had here in New Mexico during the pandemic was this very issue of access to the internet, and looking at, if we are going to have a more digitized society, there are certainly going to be haves and certainly going to be have-nots. How can you tell us a little bit more about this sort of attention to digitization? I love the arguments that people have made over the last year that access to the internet is essentially a human right, and therefore we have to ensure that everyone who wants access to it can get it. Can you speak to that? Because I know it's even though New Mexico certainly has its parallels, in the world beyond. Tell us a little bit about what that means, and break down digitalization for us a little bit.
Sure. So for us, I think for all of us at COVID, what we've realized is there was a lack of democratization of access to resources. I think everyone in the development world has always talked about access to basic services. But internet connectivity has become a basic service, just like water, just like food, just like health. And what we have started to do, and how we started defining what does digitalization mean for the region, it includes a couple of components. The first is rural connectivity. And this is something that I saw firsthand living in Colombia and also traveling through South America, where it's astonishing, where you come from a very urban setting where you don't even think twice about connectivity. It might be a little slow because you're on 4G and not on 5G. I experienced that as well living in Bogota, but you still have it. And then you travel to areas where they don't even have electricity, much less a tablet or a laptop. And what we've discovered and uncovered is that connectivity comes part and parcel as part of a bigger issue, which is having the resources and the means to actually have access to the tools like a cell phone or a tablet, so that you can actually go to school. I've heard stories of people living in rural areas who had access to one computer. 8 different families had 8 different kids, each had to share it. And so kids were having maybe 1 hour of school a day, because then they had to give the computer to someone else in the community. So component 1 is access in rural areas, and also turning to urban areas. How can we make sure that every socioeconomic strata in urban areas has equal access to cheaper services, to being able to have the income to buy a cell phone or a tablet? We need to talk about that, because that's also poverty. There's poverty in urban areas in Latin America, and we can't deny that. Component 1. Component 2 is also the concept of how to ensure that we're educating the users of the technology. We saw that here in the United States, where my little boy's teacher struggled when last March it was an immediate transition to teleschool. What does teleschooling look like? Teleeducation, how do you do that? How do you wrangle 8-year-olds to sit in front of a screen for 8 hours. So what we're doing is providing financing for capacity building for teachers at every level, because we've identified that that's a huge area where we can build the capacity for teachers, you can build the capacity for parents, and it trickles down. And the third component for digitalization is obviously the idea of using technology at the level of governments to facilitate access to resources and to facilitate transactions, because the cost of transactions in Latin America historically, for all of the watchers of Latin America, know that transaction costs are incredibly high. What does that mean? It means that businesses can't get licenses. It means labor informality continues. So we've also looked at the concept of digitalization for governments. And actually recently we just approved a $600 million loan to Peru to facilitate digitalization of various sectors, to include education and government, that we're really proud of and excited about.
Let's talk about climate change for a minute. Obviously, this is a massive issue in every country around the world, but Latin America, specifically Central America, has experienced some pretty extreme changes in their climate that are affecting, everything from agriculture to health and so on. Tell us a little bit about, IDB's approach to addressing climate financing goals and climate change more broadly.
Sure. I actually was just reading before joining this session that Brazil is experiencing some of the coldest climates it's seen. So it's not sure that it'll be able to reach its harvest yields that they were anticipating, which I think about in the context of how our country is burning with huge, massive heat waves. And so I think that is emblematic of the crisis that all of us are addressing and trying to figure out how to do it creatively. The IDB has always addressed climate change as an integral issue of its institutional strategy. What we did coming in is elevate that to making it a key priority. How do we do that? We are no longer just looking at it as a component of a much larger operation. We're now trying to transition and pivot to creating a pipeline for climate change and climate resilience and adaptation projects. We announced in March an Amazon initiative. What is that? That's an initiative that was born out of an agreement between the Amazon countries called the Leticia Pact that was dormant for a little bit. And then we came in and started pushing it aggressively because there's a huge demand for climate finance, and there's a huge opportunity for job growth in that sector. So we announced that we're really proud of it. We're creating a special unit out of the president's office that will guide all of the work. And that is going to be sort of the starting point for us in terms of being able to create capital that is strictly focused on climate finance and developing projects that strictly focus on climate finance. I think for us as an institution, especially on the private sector side, we have been working hard to reach our 30% target on climate finance, and proudly we're getting there. But we want to be more aggressive. And obviously with an eye toward COP26 in November, what we're also doing and what we've also announced is that the IDB needs to move expeditiously to be 100% Paris aligned. That's requiring a lot of work because we have countries in the region that are already ready for renewables, like Colombia, or decarbonization, where we've seen Costa Rica, and we actually worked with Costa Rica on decarbonization project that's quite successful, or electromobility, which is becoming a huge issue of interest for Chile. But we also have countries like Guyana who have newly discovered fossil fuels. So how can we help them be responsible in the use of fossil fuels? How can we help governments and countries that are transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables? How can we help finance them in that transition? So we have an array of demand, and we have policies that we need to streamline. So I'm really proud to say that we're actively working on it very aggressively. 30% is our threshold. We're working at it, meeting it. We're also doing a lot on the private sector side on green bonds, on the use of creative tools, and the emission of those bonds, I think, is setting a standard for the region. And I'm really glad to say that also on ESG standards, we've been really aggressive in setting forth those safeguards and policies so that a lot of our projects are aligned. We understand there's a lot of capital out there. And actually there was a recent conversation where there was a discussion about what do we do to improve our ability to climate finance to de-risk, because risk is a big problem. A lot of institutional investors are not persuaded by it because there's a lot of risk. So we need to do our work in terms of de-risking, and we need to do our work in terms of providing the tools and the financing creatively so that we can attract those investors. Obviously, we saw Eta and Iota, we saw the devastation. For us, climate change is a priority. Creating a pipeline of projects, working with Caribbean countries on resilience, disaster resilience is huge. Adaptation is also equally as important, and mitigation as well. And so I think capacity building, financing for reforestation, sustainable land use, bioeconomy. All of those are currently our priorities under climate change. And I'm really excited about the work that we're trying to do. We want to be a leader on this issue. And I think if we set the tone, making climate change a priority, it helps make it a conversation point with ministries, with governments in the region. I think climate change has never really been viewed as a solution to the problem of job growth. We're trying to pivot it so that it is viewed as part of the solution. It's part of the formula. And if I could just add one other detail that I'm really excited about personally, is that as part of these efforts, we also are trying our best to see how we can better integrate the work with traditional communities, Afro-descendant communities, and those indigenous communities that live and survive on nature and the Amazon. And that's something that I'm very committed to ensuring that we are now touching those communities so that they understand that this isn't about wholesale finance to change their way of life, to finance projects that will affect them negatively, but that will support their way of life in a sustainable way.
That's fantastic. I want to talk about gender for a little bit, and I think let's put the lens onto the IDB itself. Women in leadership at IDB. You are the first woman chief of staff. Tell me how the whole, idea of advancing gender equality, gender opportunity, and so on. How is that playing out in the bank, and then how is that, or at the IDB, and then how does that express itself in its support for initiatives across the region?
Sure. I'm really excited. I'm excited about the representation that women now have at executive levels at the institution. I think it was about time. I'm really excited and I'm proud and I'm honored that I was given that opportunity to be able to have the position that I have, because I think that that's opened up the doors for a lot of women in the bank. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from women in the bank who have never seen a woman in this position before. And that has now literally given them some hope of upward mobility in the institution. Our executive vice president, Reina Irene Mejia, she used to be the CEO of Citi in Honduras. She is the highest ranking Latin American woman ever for the institution. So we're breaking those glass ceilings, I'm proud to say. And I'm sad to say that they still existed, but we're doing it. We're doing the work now. And between Reina and I, we're a very potent tag team in terms of being very vocal about the women's equality and empowerment issue. But it goes beyond that. It goes to the diversity and inclusion issues within this institution. Women, I'll start with that and I'll transition a little bit to the broader scope, but women in the region, I think, suffer from a lot of paradigmatic structures that have been inherited. I having worked in the region, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for women to get a seat at the table. And I think that in this institution, those challenges were reflected, and it's not a fault of anything. It's just that the institution adopts the culture. And that's just how it is. Have I encountered some unfortunate conversations even in my short time here? Yeah, I have. And I've been pretty open about how there's a zero tolerance policy for any misperception about women's roles or ranks in this institution. If a woman is empowered in her job, and my big push here is feel empowerment for where you are. Don't get consumed by a title. Be consumed by your own empowerment and how you can influence and persuade. And that's been a message that's been taken on board by a lot of women here. Most of my staff, for the exception of one, are women. For the first time ever in the office of the president. And obviously, we are continuing to find ways to figure out how to create opportunities for women in the bank. Our vice president for countries and I have been working very closely on that to improve representation in the region. So I'm also very proud to say that we're nearing 40% of our 26 representatives are women. Women that were hand selected because of their credentials, because of their expertise, because of their time in the institution and knowledge of the institution, all were selected because they are excellent representatives for the bank. So I'm really excited of the direction that we're moving in. I think it's a good model. Segueing a little bit to promoting it in the region, you can't walk the walk if you don't do it yourself. So we need to model this idea of diversity and inclusion more broadly, making sure that all of the faces of the region are represented. All of the faces of all of the communities that we're trying to help are represented. We're working on that. The IDB is EDGE certified. We're continuing to work. We have over 40% women in managerial positions. I would love to get it to 90%, but that's just my personal preference. Gender writ large in the region, we're doing quite a bit on the private sector side and public sector side. Over 40% of the financing that we provided has a gender lens. What does that mean? That we're touching it, but we're not yet making it a priority. So that's why we're trying to also do kind of what we're doing with climate change, how to figure out how to put gender on the map for government so that they understand that by providing financing and focusing projects on women and girls, you're actually investing in the future. I'm a big believer that if we give women a chance in the region, they're the best entrepreneurs. They pay back loans on time. They pay them all back. They're the most reliable investments that you can make. So for us, investing in gender is great economic policy, but it's also a great development strategy, because for us, women mean growth.
Thank you, Jessica. That's super
Sure.
inspiring. I am going to ask you one more question, then we're going to go to our audience for some questions. There's already some great ones. If you have questions out there, folks, please enter them into the Q&A panel. But my last question is about the amazing complexity and challenges of working and supporting initiatives in Venezuela. We saw some missteps or some confused steps under the Trump administration in terms of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. We currently have a president there who is, weakening rule of law structures and has arguable serious support from narcotraficantes. How does the IDB approach a state like Venezuela, knowing that poverty, coronavirus, and so on are on the rise all across that country?
Sure. Venezuela is tough. It's complicated for the institution for a few reasons. It's in terms of operations, it's very challenging. When I came in, one of the first questions I asked after Haiti was, "Where are we on Venezuela?" Mm-hmm. What we're doing right now is trying to reevaluate our position in Venezuela, because what we're seeing is that with COVID, it just exacerbated a lot of the humanitarian problems that all of us are very familiar with. We've got, almost 2 million migrants alone in Colombia, 5 million across the region. So we got a hint of the actual problem, but I think COVID uncovered a whole lot more that was going on in the country. So we're in the process of reevaluating our approach and our stance in Venezuela, and that's something that we think is important. We know other multilaterals are interested in investing in the day one. We've come in with the focus that the IDB should be the first mover for a whole host of reasons for day one. But how can the IDB be an active participant now in trying to alleviate a lot of the humanitarian constraints and issues and problems that they're facing? So we're undergoing an evaluation of our position right now. A lot of the other challenges in terms of operating or implementing agencies and mere access, just getting access to the right populations and communities. So all of that is part of a serious and significant due diligence process that we're undergoing internally to see how we could even potentially do more. Obviously, we're working hand in hand with organizations like the UN and PAHO, World Food Program, to address migrant needs in other countries. But we do understand that the languishing humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is just going to keep worsening. And that's why we've decided to undertake this due diligence process to see what more we could do.
Makes sense. Yes, and good luck with that. It sounds enormously complicated. So let's go to our audience for some questions.
Sure.
And we're going to come back to the topic of migration, which we haven't talked about. But before that, a question here from Benita Vasallo. Good morning. As a retiree of the IDB now living here in Santa Fe, I was interested to see that President Claver Caron stated last fall that he wanted to increase the IDB's lending from 12 to 20 billion a year. How will the administration go about making that happen? And do you expect the US government will support that increase?
Well, capital increase is definitely the part of the work that we are doing. When we came in, we were doing a review of the portfolio that the IDB has. And in 2020 alone, we dispersed and lent over $21 billion. And our thinking is that should be our sustainable level, because we're responding to needs quickly. We're responding to an array of needs. We're being agile and flexible, and it's proved that we can be an agile and flexible institution. And that's why the president made that statement, and he continues to be committed to the work of a capital increase. Now, what does that mean for us as an institution? Obviously, we were excited when we saw the legislation, the bipartisan legislation, come out a few weeks ago that supported a capital increase for us in a broader context, of course. And we're continuing to do some internal analytic work. At our Board of Governors meeting in March, the governors approved a resolution that allowed us as an administration to work on an analytic roadmap to assess where is the IDB in terms of strategic positioning. Look, the reality here for us is that we need to be the first mover in a lot of different cases. And this goes to your question on risk. Why? Because no one else is going to go in there. And why? Because we should be there. So that's the president's position on the issue. When we get to the point where we complete the analytic roadmap, we need to get into a conversation of what that actually means. Our hope internally, I'm leading a lot of those efforts right now. We've got various teams working on various parts of assessments of the bank in terms of macroeconomic and social impacts of COVID in the region. We're looking at where are we financially, what tools are we using, how are we optimizing everything at our disposal, what are we looking at in terms of resource mobilization. We're doing all of that analytic work, and we hope to be able to present that to our Board of Governors at the next meeting so that we can actually have a conversation in earnest about what a discussion on a capital increase would even look like for the bank. We're trying to take this step by step. Again, we're excited that we have bipartisan Senate support for the first time ever. The IDB is on the radar and on the map, but internally and institutionally, it's very critical for us to do the homework so that we can demonstrate to all of our shareholders, non-borrowing and borrowing, that we've done the work to ensure that we know where the institution sits today and where it needs to sit by next year. And
congratulations on getting bipartisan support. No easy feat in this day and time. Tell us a little bit about some of the mechanics of where the money for the bank comes from. Obviously, the U.S. government puts a fair bit in. Where else? What are the other sources of funding for the IDB to go ahead and invest in the region?
Sure. So we, like you just said, we have shareholders. The United States is our largest shareholder. So we have what's called paid-in capital that was used to fund the bank. And then we have our non-borrowing members who are, I hate to use the word donors, there are donor partners who also help with co-financing and mobilization of resources. On the private sector side, I would say it's also the same. We have paid-in capital and also mobilization, core and catalytic, that helps us leverage the money so that for every dollar, we can get either 1.5, 1.6x on it, and then we can actually build from there. So for us, it's a matter of making sure that we have the resources that we need and to prove that we can deliver when there is a crisis.
Okay, so let's go to the big bucket that we did not talk about earlier, which is migration. And sure. Tell us a little bit about the IDB's approach to, first of all, helping people stay in their countries so that they don't migrate, but then also, and this is a question from our audience from Dudley Hafner, how does the IDB's work take pressure off the US-Mexico border?
Sure. So what was created was in April of 2020, a migration unit to address the Venezuelan migrants. And to date, we've dispersed, I think, close to $1 billion in different programs, not just from my migration specific lens, but from different programmatic activities to address migrants and the presence of Venezuelan migrants all over the region. What we've done is we've looked to expand the rubric for the migration unit to see how we can actually address migration as a theme everywhere in the region. The movement of people is a fundamental premise. As a political scientist by training, you always talk about the movement of goods and people. It's fundamental. It's always going to keep happening. And the problem is, how do we relieve that pressure for countries? So we've expanded the scope of the migration unit work, and we're undergoing that examination now. And we recently, in a public forum with Canada, announced that we were going to put forward about $25 million for future funding for programmatic activities to support migrants in a broader scale, not just Venezuelan, but also in Central America. How does the IDB work to alleviate the pressure? I think the work that we're doing, focusing on jobs, on skilling, on education, touching local communities, access to electricity, which is a big issue in the countries that we're discussing of the Northern Triangle. We're doing a lot to try to address the core issues that I guess are not defined as the root causes, which is insecurity, poverty, lack of access to services. We're actively doing that. And we're actually working on developing and further refining, I should say, a program that we're trying to promote for an examination of how we can also bring in the private sector. I think what we've identified is that the public sector gets to a certain point. We need to bring in the private sector and build confidence between those two actors. And what we're trying to do in the Northern Triangle is be that honest broker who could bring all of the stakeholders, including civil society, who's a huge stakeholder, around the table and see how we can identify priority areas. I'm very excited about that. I think it'll be a good contribution to the work in an organized way and in a very methodological way, so that we're not financing everything and hoping to get the results. I think what we're trying to do is streamline our work in the Northern Triangle so that it is thematic, it is strategic, and that it's measurable, because that's ultimately going to be what helps and contributes to the diminishment of the numbers of people and the flows of people leaving their countries because of all of those issues. Public sector reform, security, policing, citizen security are all issues that we're actively working on. And our migration unit is small, it's nascent, and we're looking to get increased donor confidence in us and working with us. And we're actually looking at, as I said before, the Haiti example kind of taught us how to see about developing a mechanism so we can be that pot and donors can put their funds here and we can start prioritizing them together. So that's a lot that we're doing on migration in one fell swoop.
No kidding. Let me ask you something that I feel like you would have a unique insight into. This morning, I was reading that Elon Musk is going to now re-accept taking Bitcoin for people buying Teslas, which is a whole other topic. But El Salvador, President Bukele has said recently that they are going to move to make Bitcoin an official currency in El Salvador. How in the world is that going to work?
I think that's a question everyone's asking that I've heard since the announcement. Look, countries have a sovereign right to take the decisions they need to take to address vacuums and gaps in their economies. For us, and I think the president recently made some statements about this, and I think for us as an institution are pretty clear. We offer a lot of digital payment programs. We have the LAC chain program. We have a lot of different activities that we as an institution are funding to facilitate the movement of funds and money and access to digital payments and financial inclusion that provide safeguards institutionally and that provide security and transparency to a lot of transactions. The Bitcoin decision, again, a country can make those decisions on its own. We are concerned about the volatility that that would introduce in terms of a dollarized economy. I think that Bitcoin, and I was just looking actually at the Bitcoin prices that were dropping precipitously a few days ago, I think just demonstrates the level of volatility of such a currency that isn't adequately managed. And I think the transparency concerns are valid. That being said, we have conveyed that we are continuing to work through our digital platforms to provide support to governments in a responsible way so that they do have access to what they need and there's greater financial inclusion and investment in a transparent way.
Yes, somebody sent me an article a few weeks ago about an American entrepreneur who was busy trying to install as many Bitcoin ATMs as possible in El Salvador. And I don't even know what that means either. But
I don't either.
So I know the IDB doesn't work in Cuba at all, but I have to ask, given what's going on in Cuba right now, which seems extremely significant, and I love the slogan that's being adopted, fatherhood and life as opposed to fatherhood fatherland or death. If things keep progressing in Cuba, if we see, I know these are a lot of big ifs, if we see a change of government, if we see U.S. policy towards Cuba change as a consequence of that change in government in Cuba, what would the IDB be doing in terms of thinking about Cuba and investing in it? Is it too early to speculate on that? Or, what would be some of the areas or things that the IDB might think about in terms of supporting, Cuban civil society and, of course, a new government? What would be possible?
Well, Cuba isn't a member, and we abide by the Charter of the Organization of American States. We were born out of the Organization of American States, so I think, it's too soon for us to say or to even develop a position on any of that. I'll leave that to the powers that be and greater minds than mine to assess, what's next and what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I know you've met with a lot of different leaders from around Latin America. Tell us, who's your most interesting leader that you've met, or the most interesting conversation that you've met? I mean, these are a dynamic group of folks who have are often elected with sweeping mandates to change things, and
Sure.
Bukele is a great example of a young and charismatic figure elected to really try to help solve these intractable problems. Can you, tell us a little bit about some of the leaders or a leader that you've met that really made a mark on you?
Sure. I think that's a really great question that I think I've always wanted to be asked, because I've always wanted to have the access and capacity to have professionally, to sit in meetings with important leaders. I hesitate to name a single one because I don't want to seem preferential, because really all of them, sitting through meetings with leaders and heads of state who are either facing an economic boon or an economic crisis, what I'd rather tell you is they've all taught me a few key traits of leadership and commitment that to me have resonated. So it's more than a single person that has affected me. It's more of the common traits that I've noticed and the threads among all of them. And I'll name two to start. The serenity in decision making and the love of country. That to me, I think when you look at the region objectively, so I, as an American, even though I'm a first generation, studying the region, you think to yourself, how can these problems persist? How can there not be solutions? And then when you have meetings with heads of state and you hear from them that they recognize the same problems, but they have this serenity about it in terms of being very centered, that these are sort of perennial problems that I have to deal with that slowly can be solved, that knee-jerk reactions don't help. The thoughtfulness that I've seen in that decision making, the thoughtfulness and the understanding of the dynamics and the complexities has truly, that's left a mark on me as a human being, as a student of the region, as a professional, dedicated wholeheartedly to the region. And then their love of country. I'm a very proud American. I'm a proud Latin American woman. To me, I don't even know how to articulate it. It is so impassioned, and it's such a drive to have sat through meetings with leaders, men and women, who just want to do the right thing. And having witnessed that with various heads of state who just want to do the right thing, what I took away from that is that some of these decisions are really difficult. It might seem like a policy decision is easy to make. A fiscal reform, sure, it makes sense. But these leaders actually have that human touch. How is this really going to affect my people? Not because of a poll or a protest. Is it really going to help these people who don't have income, or these people who pay taxes because they're lawful abiding citizens? Their capacity of humanity, of passion, of love, and to make those hard decisions really struck me, and it really resonated with me throughout my career and ability to sit through them. And it affects me here, and I can tell you it affects the way that the president of the IDB sees the problems, that you can't lose that human touch, and you have to remain centered and calm, even within the trials and tribulations and in the storm, because with that serenity, that's how you get to a better outcome and better conclusion.
Two more questions for you, and thank you so much, Jessica. This has been so interesting. First question, and I admit up front, I have been binge watching the Netflix show Narcos, but
Yeah.
we know that one of the major threads that connects Mexico and Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Colombia and Peru and Bolivia is the narcotics trade. Do you see changes in terms of how that influences government and governance across the region? Do you have fears for it? Tell us a little bit about how IDB approaches this massively, unstabilizing force in the region.
Sure. I mean, I'd like to say that I'm shielded from it now after 15 years in national security, where as being a professional dedicated to Latin America, dealing with the presence of a FARC or an ELN or drug cartels was always preeminent. Here, we look at it from a very different perspective. We look at it as at how we can work with governments to strengthen institutional capacity and governance. how to ensure that there's a presence in areas where it's needed. I think that the work that we're doing on citizen security, on strengthening policing capacity, is huge, and it's innovative. I think that a lot of the work that the IDB is doing in terms of helping governments understand the types of reforms that are required in their ministries of security, and or interior, or whatever the ministry is that's responsible for it, I think is also critical. For us, we look at it from the aspect of can we help institutions grapple with the problem, not providing them the solution to how to nab the next bad guy, but how do you have the institutional capacity to respond? And then how do you have the technology that you need to investigate, to put the pieces together so that you can do the work that's ultimately your responsibility of nabbing all of the bad guys. I think a lot of the work that we're doing in our division of institutions and policy reforms is really very innovative. And I think that a lot of this is also technology based. We're trying to get governments more connected to technologies that can help them to have investigative capacity. We do a lot of work with DHS in certain areas in the region to collaborate, because where they have technologies that I know firsthand are incredibly useful, like biometrics, et cetera, we're trying to help bring that to the space that we work in development, so that you have, like I said, the free flow of movement of goods, legal goods and people, and that it's tracked, it's traceable, and that governments have a way to ensure that whatever illegal activity is happening, they can better identify sooner and address.
So let's switch for our very final question to one of my favorite questions I love asking people, which is, when you look at the region today, what's one thing that gives you just a great sense of optimism and hope for, for a better future for folks living across the region?
Ecuador. I think the election in Ecuador, and I'm not saying this because my mom was Ecuadorian, I've experienced everything that Ecuador has experienced. And I say this also because I always share this anecdote that as a half Colombian, half Ecuadorian, I shared the violence of Colombia through a telephone every call from my family every Sunday, where they would tick down all the horrible things that were happening. Same thing used to happen with my history with Ecuador, and how I experienced it at a distance, sort of the volatility, the uncertainty, the impact on the people. I think the election in Ecuador, for me personally, proved that the people have a voice, that the people are discerning, that they could see the difference night and day of what democratic standards and transparency look like, what needed economic reforms could actually result in. It was a tough test case for the region, but they accomplished a lot. And I don't mean the government, I mean the people. That confidence in the people to vote for their brighter future gives me confidence in the region, because I'm a big believer that if people have confidence in their voice and vote, and that it matters, that's life altering for a country. So that gives me optimism.
I couldn't agree more. Even just reading, about the Peruvian election and how this now president came from absolute obscurity by really helping people understand where their vote goes and what it means and what kind of society, how it needs to be fixed from the kind of bottom up. To me, that's massively encouraging, hugely challenging, but massively encouraging.
Exactly. Getting people, not to have a tangent, but voting matters, right? And so getting people in the region to feel involved, seeing youth in the region involved, politically motivated, interested, acknowledging the issues, debating the issues. I think having open debate is so healthy. And I feel that seeing voters take their right, which was fought for and defended, right? And no matter where the chips land, just the fact that citizens are finally making their voices heard, I think is a positive step.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Jessica Bedoya, Chief of Staff and Executive Advisor in the Office of the Presidency at the Inter-American Development Bank, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us this morning. Absolutely fascinating. And best of luck to you and all the challenges that await you on a daily basis.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Well, you have a great day. And for everybody out there, we'll see you in a couple weeks when we resume our rule of law sessions. And Jessica, once again, thank you so much. And we'll see you all later.
Have a good day.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.